What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Wing and Tail Boys podcast, your Northeast hunting and fishing destination. I'm Chris.
And I'm Angelo.
And we're your hosts. Join us as we navigate the woods and waters of the Northeast, sharing our passion for the outdoors.
Whether it's land management, outdoor recreation, hunting, or fishing, we're going to cover it all. With 40 plus years of experience in the Northeast, we'll provide insights, tips, and stories to help you make the most of your adventures and help you experience the wild.
So, tune in, grab your gear, and let's hit the woods together. And always remember, success is just a commitment away. What is up? Hope you guys are doing well. Welcome back to the Wing and Tail Boys podcast. As I record today's intro, it is Monday, March 1st, and spring is upon us. The weather just keeps getting better and better. Here in PA, it's been awesome. Granted, we've had a little bit of rain in the last few days, but I mean, that's to be expected, right? We're almost into April. April showers bring May flowers, if you will. With that being said, I've been getting out. I've been doing some scouting, been finding some great deer sign from last year's rut, and I'm hoping to be able to use that to find some success moving into this coming year. I'm looking for the right guest to bring on to talk to about that, and I'll be able to share all that stuff with you, as well as ask some questions as to how they may break down that piece of property moving forward. In addition, I've got myself a couple of turkey calls. I've been working with them. I'm not the greatest, but I think I'm starting to get the hang of it. Never used a mouth call before, never been out turkey hunting before. So this year, hopefully, will be the first year for all of that, and we'll see if I can find some success. Maybe I'm setting the bar a little low, but as of now, my goal is to try to get a bird to gobble back at me. If I can get that to happen this year, first year out, I'll find that a success. And then if that happens, I'll set the new goal out to getting one into shooting range. And then, we'll take it from there and we'll see what happens. Moving into today's episode, we're continuing with the Science of Arrow Flight series. For those of you who have been up with us for a while, you know about the series already. For those of you who are joining us for the first time or you haven't heard about the Arrow of Science series yet, I talk about this in the beginning of the podcast. But long story short, Dorge of Fire Knock and I, we've been doing a Science of Aeroflight series for weeks now. I believe this is the 8th or 9th installment of the series, where we just break down the science of aeroflight, the ins and outs, what happens to an arrow, how does your bow react, what materials are used, yada, 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 so on and so forth. Like I said, we kind of do a little bit of a recap as we get into the beginning of the episode, so I'm not going to bore you with listening to that multiple times. Before we get into the episode, once again, I want to give a quick, big shout out to Vitalize Seed. They have been awesome. Last episode, we had Al Temechko on, one of the co-owners of Vitalize Seed, and it was just a fantastic episode. We talked about soil health and the place for tillage in a system, even if you're doing no-till. We talked about the benefits of no-till, the option of not no-tilling. Either way, whatever it is, Vitalize Seed has something for you. And as we're getting into April, this is the time of year where a lot of us are starting to think about our spring food plots. And maybe you're behind the ball a little bit. You haven't gotten to plan what you're going to plant. If that's the case, head on over to vitalizeseed.com and check out the options that they have for your spring planting as well as your warm season planting while you're at it. For the spring, or for someone who's like me in a colder climate, just doesn't have, their soil doesn't warm up fast enough, they have 2 different clover blends that are just perfect for you. Or if you just want something to get on the ground, get something growing early while you wait to plant that summer blend, the clover blends can also work for you. So head on over to vitalizeseed.com, check out those options, and give Al a holler, let him know what you think. Without further ado, guys, enjoy this week's episode and have a great week. And until next time, remember, success is just a commitment away. I'm joined again today by Dorge Huang of Fire Knock. How you doing today, Dorge?
I'm doing quite okay.
Fantastic. Same here, same here. And we are continuing on with our arrow series today. We've been focusing on the main component of an arrow build, which happens to be the shaft. And over the last few episodes of our Science of Arrow Flight series, we've talked about some of the things that happen in flight. We've talked about the 5 motions of arrow flight, the 5 stages of arrow flight. We've talked about the history of arrows and how the progression of materials have changed and how it's affected arrow flight throughout time. And then from there, we started going into some of we spoke specifically on carbon and aluminum. We spent a good amount of time talking about that. And once we were done talking about carbon, we went into the different arrow sizes. We focused
And the
on
benefit and characteristic of each.
Exactly. So far now we have talked about the standard arrow size, which is the 246 class. We've talked about larger diameter arrows, which are the 300 and above arrow class. And then we spent a whole episode talking about the beloved 204 arrow class, which is the smaller, or considered the smaller diameter class.
Yeah,
Today,
the initial smaller, which is the exercise, which is
Right.
the beginning of it. I think they come out in 2004. That's when the Axis first showed up on the market.
Right. Now, today, we have some hard truth to share with you guys because we're getting into the micro diameter shafts, which is the 166 class of arrows. And we know what the industry says. We know the benefits that everybody believes that these arrows have. And we're here to set the story straight today. So we're going to start to talk about the history of the 166, where it came in, why it came to be, and then we're going to talk to you about the pros and cons and what you can do to overcome the downsides of the list. So, Dorge, if you'd like to take it away, tell us a little bit about the history of the 166.
First of all, 166 is not so-called micro diameter. It's the second one above it. The true micro is actually the 125.
Oh, okay.
The 125 and 166, both of them are what you call it, the target artery size. Those are used in the World Artery, Europe, and also in NFAA, especially a lot of time with field artery, in other words. NFAA on the thin ones and also on the larger ones. The reason that a lot of people, these thin sizes come in because in this specific artery environment, initially, target artery is like you've got about, say, 4 guys shooting 8 arrows at the same target.
So there's enough, they made them so that way there's enough space within
Not
the
just
target
that,
for all the arrows to
because
fit.
the majority of these arrows are used in non-compound bows.
So long bows, like more traditional stuff, longbow,
Absolutely.
recurve
Traditional
bow.
archery, what you call the Olympic class or the European called the World Archery class arrows. They are very thin. They're supposed to make for a long time, usually 100 meter or 110 yard, that kind of deal. And then not to mention, in some cases, you're talking like 8 archers, 4 arrows per person shooting at a target. They've got 32 arrows on a target. If everybody is, say, 2364 or even 200 size, there's not going to be much room left. And when you do a recurve, it's indeed better. There's no doubt. But of course, a lot of people thought that the 166 was the thin one. No, the 125 is. But let me just put it this way. If you thought the 166 is going to grip for your hunting arrow, you're out of your mind. Okay?
Yeah. We're going to break some hearts today, Dorge.
For truly, I mean, now, of course, the 166 is one of the arrows that have a really large rating. When I say that, because think about it, most people shoot 166 are your 12-year-old putting a 25-pound bow. What do you think the spine of the arrow is?
Like 600, 700?
800, 900, even 1,000. So 66 really have one the wider range. But then people love to show off on 166 how thin the arrow is, how sexy it look. Well, that's a matter of perspective. I won't use the word sexy, but that was what was given to everybody. So I'm not sure how it was come to be, but it is what most people use. I would say more technically advanced appearance. I would say that sounds like a more correct statement.
Right.
Okay, so the 166, why is this such a... I mean, furthermore, you need to understand, the 166 in the old days is a very expensive arrow.
What
Your
made
AC
it so
and
expensive?
so on. So you're looking at $500-$600 a dozen. Because
Why was it so expensive?
Because it's a carbon aluminum and because of size. It is really difficult to make something straight, thin, hybrid, which is ACE is aluminum and in the inside, carbon on the outside, that kind of arrow. Very much like ACC, but in the 166 class. Those are your true target archery. The spine is extremely consistent. Of course, you notice like Carbon Express make the medallion, which is also like the Rick McKinney's from Carbon Tech. Those are all $400 to $700 of shaft. So we are talking cheap. There's no point, no insert, no veins, no knock. Shaft. So this whole thing come about, and somewhere along the line, when carbon come, I remember the first company will come up, the 166 as a hunting arrow, should be Victory. They call it, okay? Then what they do is that when you do a 166, traditionally, you either do what Easton did with a very expensive capital investment, build a thing with the machine, or you do what Victory did. You roll the shaft and do a centerless grind. The price difference is about 400-500% in manufacturing cost.
Cheaper for the way
Cheaper.
Victory was doing it was cheaper?
Way cheaper.
Okay.
I mean, those are my understanding, okay? I don't know what they did, but if I do it using the way they did it, it'll be way cheaper.
Gotcha. Which is what allowed it to be available to like the mass public, essentially. At that point, it was cheap enough for people to justify spending it on a dozen.
But then that was one major problem. When you do some arrow like this, because 166 is such a thin, you can't really do a mandrel grind. So you do a centerless grind with it. Now, the OD can be as strict as you want to be, but the concentricity of the shaft from the OD to ID is where the problem begins.
So the issues with the 166 begin simply with the way they have to be built.
In some cases, you can use traditional method. Easton did a pretty good way with the injection system.
Mm-hmm.
But then, because of the OD variants, it become quite difficult. That means you got a dozen, you may have 2 or 3 that can be. I remember 166, when you look percentage, the ID is what, 4.25 millimeter? Or 4. What? Let me think. Just want to be absolutely sure that I don't quote anything. For about 4.216,
Yeah.
which will be 4. I'll call it 4.22 just to be safe.
Yeah, I think Easton markets them as their 4 millimeter arrow when you look on their website.
It is actually 4.22. Because if it's 4 millimeter, nothing will fit. But 4.2 is also a very interesting piece.
Okay.
Normally, 832, the ID, the drill body is 18 class, which is 0.169.
It's just a little hard to hear you because you stepped away.
Yeah. The 16 on a normal 0.169.
What's that?
That's the size of the hole that you will allow an 830 to go in. So you can see the 166 is a tiny bit smaller than an 832. But in most cases, when you put an 832 thread in it, the 166 will just barely allow you to put the thread in, and the thread only.
Thread for what are we talking?
The 832, which is a field point.
Field point, gotcha. Okay, now
that means in some cases, even the neck of the 166, well, the field point can't go into 166. Only the threads.
Oh, I'm with you now. I got you.
So you need to understand the size characteristic of the shaft before we can proceed. And of course, in the case of 135, you can't use a field point for it, unless you glue in.
And so, yeah, I was just going to say either a glue in or a glue over the top type of deal or something. Okay.
Right. So you need to understand, remember number 4.2. 4.2 is not a very big number, and is barely able to fit an 832 thread. So if you put a field point in it, where would the field point be?
It wouldn't be completely inside of it. It's out the front of the arrow, right?
You can't.
Right.
Because theoretically, if you put a thread on it, the thread is 832, which is 169 theoretically. But in most cases, 166 is barely the thread part, because when you grind the thread, it's smaller than the hole.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the number 8 hole size is 169. So if you put a field point into a 166, the thread will go in, not even the neck theoretically will go in. Remember the field point has 3 sides? The field point, the neck, and the thread.
And that changes the effective length of the arrow also,
No,
right?
it changes the build of the arrow. You can't put anything inside the arrow.
Which means everything needs to be either exterior or you're using the full outserts and stuff like that. Yeah.
So all standard doesn't work.
And what issues, other than obviously it doesn't fit, that in itself is an issue. But
no,
now
I want to talk about specification first.
Okay.
And then we'll talk about approach to it.
Okay.
Okay, if that's the case, we know that an ordinary insert is just no way, no how, right? So if you want an insert system, you have not a half out. Now it's a full out. That means you need to have a stem that go into the shaft, then have a space to connection, the space for the thread, space for the neck, and then the field point. So in other words, it's 100%. It's called an out. It's not an outsert. It is a full out. Because an outsert and a full out is different.
What are the difference between the two?
Then outsert is considered, that means you sleeve over the shaft. That's an outsert. So in other words, when you look at the 204, majority of them use what they call a half out. That's half of the insert is outside, half of them is inside. Because it's still a portion of it is inside.
Right.
But now we're dealing with a full out. That means the entire outsert, which allowed the field point, is outside of the shaft. Which means that your effective length is also way out. But then we create another problem, the weakest link. On a full out, what is the size of the stem you can put inside the insert that is the largest? The answer is 166. So that's all you got. But then you also create a problem. the entire field point or broadhead is outside or in front of the shaft, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to add the transition area. So you make them smallest. You're going to make the transition 1 millimeter. But it does not mitigate the fact is that the entire insert neck is still 166, which is 832, or smaller than 832 by thousands. So what happens when you hit something with a full outsert? That's all you got. It's going to bend, break right there.
Right where the outsert meets the front of the carbon.
Correct, because
Right.
all you got to control it is the stem.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure on one very small. I mean, you were talking 1 millimeter, right? Or
0,
4.2.
because it's about mate together.
Yeah, but I'm talking
Holding
about
both in like that and hold
right.
it.
I'm talking
But
about the diameter, right? So
the
when
diameter
it hits
is
it, doesn't
0.166, which is 4.22 millimeter.
gotcha. So it's not a lot of there's not a lot of beef there to hold everything
No,
together.
that's not enough material. And to make things worse, if you got the frontal part of the full out plus the broadhead, now you got leverage to bend.
And that's something that there's enough force, like let's say, because obviously someone will say, as long as it kills a deer, if it breaks on a rock or something after it passes through, I don't care. But is that something that they should be worried about, or a user or a hunter should be worried about if they hit a bone?
Absolutely, because now it actually would change the direction. It's no longer a linear integrated system.
So not only does it run the risk of breaking where the outsert or the full out meets it, it also runs the risk of deflecting because the broadhead is almost working like a rudder in the front now.
Just put it this way. Your node now equals your broadhead plus your entire plus the inside. So it's significantly longer. You technically make your entire broadhead / insert system way longer. By a factor, but just for insert size out, you're adding about close to, if not as much as up to 50% longer exposed.
Yeah, right. And there's
like how much longer in the front is only, but inside the arrow shaft is only about gluing surface. But what's exposed in front of it is where your leverage is, because now your fulcrum is where the carbon meets the insert.
Right. So just to clarify what we're saying here, guys, is when for the listeners, when you put a normal field point inside of your arrow, you have a shoulder that's right behind your field point, and then right behind that is the stem that has the threads on it. In a typical arrow, when you have an insert, the entire neck and thread of that field point goes into the arrow. So there's a lot of structure there. There's a lot of stability when that field point makes contact with your target or a deer or a bone or whatever. But when you have to use a outsert or a full out, you're no longer protecting the shank of that field point inside the arrow. Everything is out front. So there's nothing holding on to it. Think about trying to use a knife where the handle is just barely inside of your hand. And, you have the blade and the handle sticking out. I mean, the second that knife catches something, it's going to go wherever it wants to. So that's effectively what we're trying to explain here.
And a lot of people, I know a few guys actually call me because I was one of the first guys who have sourced titanium. He said, just use a titanium outsert. I do some rough calculation. If you say 70-pound bow, hit the target at 35 degree, that titanium at 70-pound, 30-inch draw, hit the target at, say, 35 degree, that also will bend, even with GL5 titanium.
Sure. I mean, that even happens with fastener screws. If you turn them if you turn the titanium, and titanium's great and they hold great, but if you put too much force into them, see ya.
Yep. Because remember, at the end of the day, the part that you touch is 0.166, which is 4.22 millimeter. That's all you got.
Not much at all.
A lot of people use that so-called full-out system. I disagree with it. That's the reason when Black Eagle first come to me back in 2000, hey, Dorge, we are making the deep impact. What would you suggest? I say, I got a design on my table that I patent. I'm more than willing to let you guys use it. It's called the outsert. An outsert is defined as a system that go outside the arrow shaft. In other words, it encase the entire arrow shaft.
So it's like a sleeve that goes over the front of the arrow shaft. Yep.
Now, the AMO standard stated that the thread should be no less than 10.5 millimeter. Okay. So what I did is that I actually make the thread part of my outsert 7 millimeter.
So 7. So there's a difference of 3 there.
Correct.
3.5.
Why do I do that? Because see, I already recognize that a field point, the frontal section of the field point where the neck is close to ½ an inch. Actually, it's a tad shorter than ½ an inch. It's actually supposed to be 10 millimeter. And then the neck supposed underneath it, which got 10.5. So the total should be 20 to 21 millimeter, because there's a big tolerance variance of the AMO standard, which is unfortunate. You remember, archery started as something that people throw around for fun. So the accuracy is not there. So they allow a ginormous tolerance. We're talking close to 1/16 or more of an inch on variance.
And that's a lot. 1/16 of an inch is a lot when you're talking about fitting things and, high speed projectiles and
But
all
remember,
this stuff.
archery used to be 220 feet per second when everything sets.
Yeah.
So
I mean, started with longbows and stuff.
It's not critical.
Yeah.
Now, when you start thinking through the process, that means that if I put a 7mm area for the thread, and the front of the bow is supposed to be, say, 10, so there's 17 in front, and then I make mine 34mm long, which means that there is 17 in the front and 17 on the back. That means 17mm is grabbing the arrow on the outside.
So you're giving it stability,
and not to mention
in that way.
Because it's an outsert, now the OD is not 6mm.
And do you have anything going inside? Is there anything inside the shaft at all, or is it all exterior?
That's a good question. Remember, we talk about the field point normally is about 20 to 22mm from the neck down.
Yes.
And I only allow 17 there.
Mm-hmm.
That means no less than 3mm of the thread is actually inside the arrow now.
All right.
Is that cool? Think about it.
Yeah.
Now, theoretically, the weakest link of the entire process in the full out, which is the carbon touching the aluminum, titanium, or steel. Only thing you got is carbon holding the 166. That's your weakest link.
Which isn't all that weak.
Which is very weak.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of a full outsert, like the arrow outsert, it is an 8mm of 7075 T6 aluminum holding onto a 166. And then with the field point, when they screw in it, the field point exceeded no less than 3mm in the shaft. So now that point of that arrow, which used to be the weakest, now is protected by the carbon, which is the shaft, the field point, and the outsert.
Right. And that's what I was getting at. I mean, that just solidifies everything, so I mean that's awesome. I didn't know that was your original patent. I didn't know the outsert was yours.
That original outsert is not my patent. My patent, because remember, I thought the first outsert is actually made by Beeman on the original Beeman extruded arrow, but that had one big major problem. Everybody hated it, because if you shoot that into a back target, when you try to pull the arrow, you better cut the target. If you shoot that Beeman arrow into an animal on solid muscle, you need to physically cut the muscle to pull the arrow out.
Was there too much of a lip difference between the arrow and the...
It's simply a matter of, the further you see, it's like this piece. The harder you pull on it, the more wedge you got.
Yes. Okay.
So that is what the original outsert does, which a lot of people still use. Like Black Eagle use them. Nearly most people who use 166 has shy away from the full out.
All right. So just simply because of how thin a 166 is, and simply by how you have to build them, there's a lack of structural integrity just from the standpoint of how on the insert part on the front, where essentially all of that power from your bow and your arrow, everything that is driving into your target is getting placed. All that weight, all that energy, all that strength is getting placed on the weakest link. So right off the bat, just because of the way they're built, unless you're using the full out system, right, or the outsert system, you're going to have issues just by the way you have to build them because of how thin the arrows are.
Correct.
If you're anything like me, you love to customize your bow while always making sure everything is just spot on. That's why I trust Anthony and Chris over at Big D Custom Pro Shop. They're located on Route 15 in Lake Hopatcong, New Jersey, and they have everything you need to tune your bow. And I promise you're going to leave there with a smile on your face. So, if you live in northern New Jersey, give my boy Big D a shout for all your archery needs. When I head out to the woods, I have to know that I have the best performing equipment that I can afford. So that way I'm the only variable that I have to worry about. That's why I trust Fire Knock products for all my arrow and bow accessory needs. From arrow components to bow accessories like stabilizers and arrow rests, they have what you need. Dorge won't put anything on the market if it doesn't perform 50% better than what's already out there. So head on over to fireknock.com today, to see what they're all about.
And
Wow.
then, if you as we proceed with the next stage of it, I will give you a forward to when you really want to shoot a 166 with a non-recurve. I let off compound bow because it's a 166. You want to shoot as low an FOC as possible, which make this even more complicated. Why? Because a full out is heavier.
I
And
gotcha.
you also push the more material more forward. So you artificially increase the length of the arrow.
So let me pause you. Let me pause you there real quick, because we've talked about the inserts and the issues that come about on the front of the arrow. What about on the back of the arrow? Does the 166, the diameter of the arrow, does it cause any issues either with the knock or fletchings when it comes to a really thin arrow?
It really do not do much because with the today's, I mean, unless you're shooting over 95-pound bow, in current plastic polycarbonate, which I use Macalon, which is one of the better stuff, you really do not have that big an issue. So the 166, I mean, as long as you've got a good knock, Baita make decent knock, Eastern make decent G knock, I make G knock, Boning make knock. Just remember another point: when you make something smaller, precision become key because every variance is exaggerated.
It's each piece is a larger percentage of the overall diameter.
Correct. Remember, in 246, your variation is pretty your 232 to 236 or 237. But in 166 is 1665 to 16575 to 1665. Tiny. But that alone, percentage-wise, is big.
Absolutely. So, oh boy. So the back of the arrow is okay. As long as you have the right knock, a quality knock, no issues with the fletchings. Does it cause any issues with the gluing? Do you need a certain jig? Do you need a better jig when it comes to veins?
It becomes a really big deal because in the market, 90% of people using a Bissenberger. The Bissenberger is designed to fletch a 2219, the Mako knock on with a heavy helical or a strict fletch.
Here's my bits. I was trying to figure out how to put this 1/16 bar stock on, but we'll get to that at another time.
But then the fact is that if you remember your geometry days, which some of you prefer not to, just like I wrote a cartoon, the old man die. You say, I die without using math once.
Use math every second of every day.
The fact is that when you're dealing with a circle, you need to understand or simply imagine this. The vein, put it on, if it is not the tangent, every single offset, every single helical is an arc. The smaller the diameter, the more aggressive the arc is. Because your beginning angle, your final angle can be significant.
So the thinner the arrow, the harder it becomes to fletch with a helical or an offset because the smaller the diameter, the more, like what Dorge is saying, is the more drastic that curvature is when you're trying to glue that vein.
Or which means that you're going to use a lot more glue, using the glue as a mortar to fill up the gap. When you do that, your consistency of the total glue weight on all three veins is extremely hard to control. Let me give you an idea, because I think I mentioned this, but I will reiterate it again. If you do a blazer on a heavy helical using a Boning Platinum Plus, it uses an average of 0.75 to 1.5 grain of glue. That's a 50% variance.
Yeah, from fletching to fletching.
Yes. And if you, of course, if you happen to own the arrow vein jig and using arrow vein using AGO 600, this is a statistic accuracy. To put a arrow vein onto any shaft, doesn't matter the size, the total amount of grain weight use of glue is 0.03.
Now, is that just because it's a less dense glue? Is it because the glue fills up the gaps? What's the reason that makes the AGU work that way?
Well, first of all, I don't know whether you understand the word drawmeter. No, actually, no, not drawmeter. It's centiploid. Centiploid is a definition of liquid fluidity.
Okay.
Basically, your Boning Platinum Plus is about 20,000 because it's a super hard gel. And it also is what you call a thinner base system. That means it evaporates whatever left over is what you bond with. So based on humidity outside, based on application and so on, it's very hard to wipe off the excess because you really ruin the glue. So when you apply it, the glue now got bubbles in it and so on. When you push it down, you need to fill the gaps because you're dealing with an arc. And the vein is technically flat in 90% of the time. So you're trying to do a flat surface with a curved application, which is not matched, and using the Boning Platinum Plus to fill the gap. it is not a good situation.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that makes sense. And again, this becomes more drastic because of how thin that arrow is. And
Correct.
trying to turn that. I mean, think about it, guys. If you have something fatter, that curve is going to take up less of the circumference of the arrow, if that makes sense. If you can picture that, like, how do I put this? So a 166 is thinner, obviously thinner than a 204, obviously thinner than a 246. If you take a 3-degree helical, that 3-degree of the 166 is going to be a much larger percentage than the 3-degree on a 246. Right.
Exactly.
So that curve takes up more space, and it's harder for that. I mean, we all love stiff veins. We all know stiff veins are going to control your arrow a little bit better. And the stiffer the vein, the less it wants to curve. So you're trying to force something that doesn't want to curve around something that has a tighter curve, and it's just a recipe for disaster.
And that was the reason when I first thinking of the vein is that I would talk more about this in arrow vein when we go into the discussion of arrow vein. But just think about it. In the worst case scenario, is 1.5 grain of glue. It can be more, but we're just using a blazer on a short 2-inch peel. That's 1.5 grain of glue on it. In the worst case scenario, the arrow vein with the AGO600 is 0.03. Now, just do a fast math, okay? 1.5 divided by 0.03 is equals to 50 times. Yeah, 50 times.
Yeah, it's 15 times lighter on the back of your... 50. Gotcha. Yep. Well, that makes sense. Duh. Yeah.
So technically, if you put 3 veins on the shaft, best case scenario, worst case scenario on an arrow vein is about 0.1 grain. And the worst case scenario on a blazer is about 4.5. And the best case scenario on even at 0.75, you're still looking at 2.25.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to having a little bit more weight on the back of my arrow. No. We've talked about having a balanced arrow. What the problem here is that you can't control. You put one vein on, it could have, like you said, 1.5. Another one you put on can have 1, and another one you put on can have 1.2. Never mind the balance of your arrow from front to back. Your arrow is not balanced around the circumference of the arrow. And the faster something rotates, the more out of whack it becomes. We've used this analogy in the past. Think of an old school washing machine that's turning and trying to spin cycle your clothes. That is out of balance. That thing is bouncing all over the floor. Now think about that on an arrow that's spinning astronomically tighter and faster than the washing machine.
Yes. I mean, in some cases, in pure math, the thinner the arrow, the closer it is to center, the less the effect it should have been. Agreed. But then also increase the complexity and the skill level of the person putting the veins on.
Right.
You're dealing with an arc.
And you have to be more perfect because, again, that arc is tougher. And I think at this
we're
point...
not going to jump into the benefit of arrow vein in this episode. But since you mentioned the back, let's go back to the front. Because that is a big, big problem with the entire 166. It is not a problem, it's just something you need to resolve. Now, we talk about the full out. Victory used that to start with. And then you also have a problem with the full out. You are opening the shaft with a long stem when you impact at an angle, isn't it?
Yeah, because the front of that arrow has the leverage, like we talked about. The front of the outsert has the leverage. So it wants to kick, and then that back end, whatever is inside the arrow, is gonna try to open that arrow opening up.
It's going to counter it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The only other way around it is simply put a collar, or what you do it. I remember the patent that was issued for Bear, which is pretty much originally used in 204, is called the half containment. That means it's a cap with the insert inside. In other words, you got a small part of the insert is over the shaft with majority of the inside. When you do that, that whole process of using a full out just literally lost. You're better off using an outsert, because now you face the same problem as an outsert. So how do you alleviate an outsert issue if outsert is such a big problem? Remember, people don't like outsert because when you pull the arrow out of a target, the outsert will now, the moment the material grab around the arrow shaft, as it approach where the outsert is, it becomes a wedge process. The larger the pressure you pull, the higher the pressure you build, the tighter it gets.
Like a Chinese finger trap.
Right. So how do you overcome it?
I don't know, but I think you're going to tell us.
Yes. Now imagine this. Anytime when you tighten something, what the usual effect you do if it becomes so wedged? What do you usually do? You get a knife and you cut the edges out to open it, right? So why not we just put some knife on the outside?
That is exactly what
the arrow outside is. It got a lot of grooves that is sharp edges inside, but internally. Remember,
All
you
right.
want to grab something. If there is space in it, it cannot build pressure.
So they just manipulated the design to.
Yes, I did. I
Okay.
manipulated the design and come up with the arrow outside, which is technically an outside with tons of grooves on the outside, which is the inspiration of that is when I happened to be cutting a potato and the potato knife got air channels on it.
That's
Of
right.
course,
Yeah.
we at Fine Art called the outside, those are blood channels, because as the outside pull, the blood will fill the gaps, and when the muscle try to tighten on those, the edges of those grooves will provide the nice edges and relief of the pressure. Now you can pull it out. Is it as smooth as it gets? No. But based on our calculation, it reduces the entire force by 65 or more percentage,
All right.
which
I
is
gotcha.
significant. It's more
Right.
than half.
That's a genius idea. Take what's already there, make it better, alleviate the issues that
That's
it
the
has.
reason
That's great.
like every other outside, Fine Art arrow outside was given a US patent. Now, let's go back to the 166 again.
Mm-hmm.
It is a really thin wall, it is a really thick wall shaft. When I say thick wall, we're talking proportionate.
Proportionate to the diameter of the overall
Correct,
diameter
because see,
of the
on a
arrow.
246, your wall usually about 0.75 millimeter. On the 160, it's more like a 1 to 1.25.
All right. So it's about 50% ish, maybe a little
No,
less.
the material is the same. You simply now you roll it on a smaller diameter. Assuming they are using the same material, we simply don't want to achieve it. Remember, the thinner it gets, the more material you need to use to achieve the large diameter size capability.
Right.
So
'cause
166
makes sense.
theoretically is automatically heavier than the 246 because not an efficient tube design.
All right. And so because of that wall being thicker, what issues does it cause in the 5 motions of arrow flight?
Well, first of all, your parabolic action theoretically based on spine is identical. Your second, your torsion, well, that's where the problem begins, not the end, begins. As the wall gets thicker, the torsion response is a consumption of energy again because you're twisting it with thick wall. Now this
So it takes
material
more-
thickness.
And
So
it
in
takes
other
more
words, we
energy
call
to
a thick wall lazier. It's a lazier or more memory effect on the shaft.
And is that because it takes more energy for the shaft to twist because of how thick it is?
Correct. The thickness, which is called a memory effect. As the wall thickness increases, the memory effect increases. So right on the get-go, the torsion is going to behave a lot more worse in energy consumption on every cycle.
So just to put it in perspective, with that being said, what we're saying here is if you were to shoot a 166 and a 246 side by side, again, same weight, same FOC, same everything overall, same length. The only difference is one is a 166 and one is a 246. The 166 is going to consume more energy faster and have less energy remaining when it reaches the target when compared to a 246.
On this subject of torsion control. Now the second portion about the ovalization in the center shaft. Well, guess what? The 166 technically doesn't exist. It can't.
It can't ovalize because the walls are too thick.
And they're so thin. So right on the get-go, every motion on the ovalization that is a pure consumption process.
And remember, if you guys recall back to when we had our episode on the 5 motions of arrow flight, we said that not all of those motions we want to get rid of. We just want to learn how to control them and use them to our benefit.
Correct.
And because of the walls being so thick and that torsion and the ovalization not being able to function the way it should, that alone, just in physics alone, it's eating away at the energy as your arrow is going downrange
during the flight process.
Right. Yeah.
Now, on top of that, because the wall is thicker, the mass is more focused. Guess what? The high frequency vibration now is now also more because of memory effect.
Yeah. Now, is that the same thing as the microflex?
Yes, that's the microflex. It's actually now more because there's nothing to dissipate it.
So I'm gonna take a stab in the dark here. The industry standard right now is high let-off, 85, 90% let-off bows. The industry standard also seems to be these micro-diameter arrows. Everybody, well, I don't want to say everybody. I use that phrase a lot, but it's not uncommon to see a hunter shooting a micro-diameter arrow. So you have these high let-off bows that create a lot of microflex using really, really thin arrows that create a lot of microflex or allow for a lot of microflex, and you're just compounding this issue downrange. And can you just remind the listeners, what is the issue with microflex? Why do we care so much about microflex?
If you don't shoot past 30 yards, microflex really is not your issue. But the fact is that you're shooting a 166, you shouldn't shoot an animal under 22 or 23 yards because the arrows are still not straight at all. In other words, which you can see in quite a few videos, shooting an animal at say 35, 40 feet from you, using an 70-pound bow, 85% off with a 15% FOC, you can literally see the arrow hit the animal. 2 or 3 inch, the swing of the lighter nut goes sideways, and that's all you got.
Yeah, and it just stops.
Right, because all the energy is used in turning the arrow sideways because the arrows are still in flux. The best way to describe it is that imagine in the initial process of the arrow behaved like it was driving on a very S-curve shaft, S-curve road. The moment you stop the train, the rest of the train fall off the track.
Yes. Think of like we've used a lot of different scenarios on these during this series, but that one I think is my favorite. You could think of a pile driver, you can think of using a chisel, all of these different things. Anything that you use to create energy or to focus energy on one spot is always straight. You never use anything that's curved. The nail isn't curved, and there's a reason for that. So, when you impact that animal, you want all of your weight, your entire arrow to be completely straight. And we've said this in the past, a heavy arrow is not the issue. The issue is how that weight is distributed and what does that arrow look like when it makes impact with the target. If your weight is all the way up front and your arrow isn't completely straight, you can't control what that arrow is going to do. And to be honest, on impact, and chances are it's going to do something different each and every time it impacts.
And to make things worse is that if you use a single bevel or two blade, the broadhead, depends on the angle and the flex of the arrow, the result can be totally undesirable. Let me give you a scenario. Imagine the arrow was impacting, and the arrow at that moment of slug force is moving at 12 and 6 o'clock on the rest of the shaft, and the arrow happened to impact with a two blade at 12 and 6 o'clock. The arrow actually going to cut downwards, and the arrow go onwards. You now have a 3-inch cut over and under.
Is that the reason why? So I've always wondered this. Is that the reason why you have like a 4-inch cut with a broadhead that's only say 1.5 inches wide?
Yes.
Like when you okay.
Because the arrow actually goes sideways. And now imagine you got a blade that's 1 inch. You put the blade in and you move your hand sideways. Now you got a 3-inch cut.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Because I always wondered that.
But see, when you do that, that's also another problem. When the arrow is moving sideways, it's dissipating energy in the sideways motion of the shaft, which consume a ton of energy, which means your energy is used. But remember, your arrow is still flexing. As it flexes down, guess what? You also flex back. Now the energy is all going forward. You use it for moving sideways twice because you anchored it by impacting it.
So to simplify all of this,
don't shoot an animal close.
Don't shoot an animal close with a 166 high let-off bow. But basically, what we're saying,
it's not good to shoot any animal with any archery equipment under quote unquote I would say under 16 yards because your arrow have not recovered unless you shoot super low FOC and you're shooting a recurve.
And that's because the more weight you have in front of your arrow, the more energy it takes to get the front of the arrow to move. So your arrow, just from release alone, is going to compress and flex more. So basically what we're getting at here, guys, is on these thinner arrows, unless you're willing to spend the money to build them properly, which I think is what we're about to move into, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're willing to spend the money to build an arrow that compensates for all of these issues in this thicker walled shaft, you're losing energy on release. You're losing energy. You're using energy and wasting energy on arrow flight, and you're losing energy on impact because it's not impacting flat. And if you're dead set on shooting a 166, I'll be honest, I think they're sexy as hell. I think they look great.
But you know what? 166 have some major benefit. I mean, I remember Jim Burnsworth has shown me that he shoot 330 yards using something like a 12 or 15% FOC, and the arrow penetrate like nothing business. If you want to shoot really long range with a minimum vein, with a reasonable heavy, 166 do have a slight advantage unless you're shooting 60 or 80 yards or above. Otherwise, you really have an issue.
Is that because it takes that long for the arrow to stop flexing in flight?
No, actually, the
higher
166
FOC?
up to it flex because it's lazy. So the residual flex is less.
All right.
Because
So
after
long-
you flex fin and everything, now because if the arrow tries to do any flex, it's not going to happen. There's so much more memory effect in it. So the arrow will be straighter as it go further down.
So
if I'm looking at the ultra left residual microflex at 60 yards, the 166 have less than the 246.
And have we? I know you've done a lot of research and a lot of testing with high speed cameras. Have you used high speed cameras at distance and seen what an arrow's? Okay.
Let me give you an idea. At high speed cameras are great to look at stuff small. So I can take a picture of a bottle when the arrow go through it. So what are you looking at?
1 instance.
3-inch space. You can't see the effect. The only thing left is the DARPA radar result we have. Tony Warden did a really good job on our final website under research. We show you all the DARPA radar result. The reason why I use DARPA radar, because DARPA radar gives you the speed in increment of 5. Like in most cases, we get the 20, 30, we're going to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 yard reading of the arrow speed. In other words, we can look at the parasitic loss or the depreciation of the speed and energy on the arrow shaft. Unfortunately, DARPA radar do not show the gyroscopic spin of the energy retained on the arrow shaft. It only shows mass and speed. It lost the gyroscopic retaining energy portion. But that itself is not a big deal unless you're using ArrowWing 3. Because normal arrows, that itself is not a factor because the spin rate is so low.
Yeah. And I don't
We'll talk
want
about that more when we
I don't
ArrowWing.
I don't want to give that away, but guys, I'm telling you, when that video comes out of the vanes, you are going to be blown away at what these arrow vanes can do. Not just on how quiet they are and how well they work, but the spin rate on them is insane, and that's all I'm going to say on that for the time being. So now let's move on. We said if somebody wants to, if somebody's dead set on using a 166, there is a way to build them to compensate for these issues.
Absolutely.
So what does that build look like? What needs to happen?
Okay, first of all, unfortunately, I had to draw arrow concept into this portion because 166 is something that if you really want to use 166, you need to find a way to force the arrow not to flex so much.
So I'm going to pause you.
We know the memory is a big deal. So now, what can we do to change the process? There's 3 approaches. The first of all, we change the behavior of the shaft. Second, we change the structural design of the insert. The third, we go outside of the standard because all 3 are against us.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the first one. We need to change the behavior of the shaft. We know that 166 is the moment it started oscillation, it takes memory effect and it will be longer, harder, more consumption. So assuming that we are still talking, the only one I'm talking about here is the arrow outsert at this moment, okay? The arrow outsert, because of its weight plus the broadhead. So right on the get-go, you're looking at, even with our outsert is 32 grain plus a few point 100. So you look at 132 grain. When you look at a full out, like the stainless steel from, say, Victory, it's 50. Now you got 150. Or you look at the Victory's aluminum, I think it's about 18. You're still looking at quite a significant number compared to, say, a normal insert on a 246, which is about 8. Oh, it's 18 compared to 150. So you're looking at, theoretically, you can claim a third difference.
And we're talking overall weight, we're talking FOC, all of these things
FOC
are affected as
even
we're increasing this.
Because when you do a full out, you're increasing the distance of the field point away from the center because you need to add the entire distance of the full out. And the closest that come to is the half out, which only sticks out compared to a normal 1 millimeter, it sticks out 14. So it's 13 more. Now, how do you overcome all this? And one of my customers, I think it's 2018, called me and we discussed. He said, I told him, he was saying, why can't I use arrow concept in the 166? I say because I use full out. He said, yeah, I can just put it inside it before I put it outside. He's right. Why not? And I tested it. It works beautifully, way better than I thought. Because what happened is that it changed the magnitude of the parabolic action of the shaft. Now, all of a sudden, 166 are actually, compared to a 246 with arrow concept, you're looking at about 9 to 12 feet. With a 166, I'm looking at about under 12 yards, compared to 23 yards. So you're cutting the effective distance in technically half, which is not a small number.
Simply because it's not flexing as much right off the bat.
Correct, because the initial flex parabolic action on the magnitude is halved.
I want to pause for just 1 second because we're bringing arrow concept into this conversation, which we haven't touched on very much throughout this series. Arrow concept is Dorge's patented arrow build, where essentially you take a 6-inch or greater tube that's smaller than your arrow's inside diameter, and you glue it inside of your arrow's shaft. So you're essentially doubling the inside of the arrow and making not your entire spine, you're not increasing the entire spine of your arrow, but you are stiffening a certain section of your arrow, which is changing how much your arrow can flex or shortening the length or the total length that your arrow flexes on.
I want to stop you there because this is what most people believe, but this was not the right answer.
Right?
The inside tubing of the arrow, I know I'm doing a little bit ahead of myself, but I want to sort of right on the get-go make sure that everyone understands. The tubing is not the pattern. The shaft, making the shaft stiffer is not the reason. The making of the inner shaft is a different modulus than the outside shaft. Every single shaft has its fundamental frequency. By using two different frequency shafts and force them to bond with each other, you got what you call it a sine wave cancellation process. But that itself that does not work. Because when two shafts of dissimilar material work together, they will fight each other. And when you put two carbon together, you would force the one side to give out carbon molecules, which now force the entire tube to lubricate itself over each other. Now, every single shaft, every single shot you do is different, which makes the arrow superbly inconsistent. You can't barely shoot the shaft and be accurate at all because the sine wave cancellation cannot happen because of the degradation of the contact surface of the two carbon shafts. So the whole process of stiffening arrow does not apply because see, if you solidly glue them together, or like one time, somebody built an arrow shaft with a thicker wall in the front and then the back, it does not work. It is not because it cannot be a homogeneous material and it cannot have a step because that would be the weakest point and the arrow will break exactly there.
Okay, so now I understand. So they flex at different frequencies,
right?
Because they're not made with the exact same material, and because of that, they're fighting each other on the flex.
Correct.
Which makes
and then when they fight, guess what's made of carbon? The carbon powder comes out, now lubricate the whole thing. Every single shaft, every single shot, and every single shaft are no longer the same. It become a nightmare. So the arrow concept is not the tube, it's the glue with the tube.
It's the glue with the tube. All right.
See, the glue I work with Hanco's. That is called I will call it HUSSE. It's a glue that gives you 60% flex with 3C penetration. That means imagine this. I'm having this glue go coated on the entire shaft on both sides. The glue is the barrier, is the what you call the mediator of both sides. But it forced to bond each side. So the moment it goes in, it do not let carbon powder form. But it forced the two sides to work against each other past the media of the glue. So the arrow concept, the glue is the number one and the most important thing. Because it is the only thing that mend the two together without breaking. Because see, I did the first one with Arrowboat 2. I thought super glue. I glued the thing together perfectly. But guess what? I end up breaking at the end of the inserts, the end of the tubings. Because that's weakest link. And I break between the insert and the beginning of the tubing. That's the weakest link. That's where they broke.
Yeah.
So this whole process is actually called mediation between the two carbon when the sine wave form, and using the mediate process, you calm both sides.
All right.
Is that cool?
See, no, that is, and I'm glad you corrected me because I guess what I was thinking in my head is kind of the same thing you're saying. I just misunderstood the way that it functions.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. The fundamental principle of 90% of people, they don't understand it. I mean, what you say is true, but it's not the reason because whatever you just say do not get the result you want because it will make every single arrow inconsistent and different. Which is the worst case scenario, isn't it?
No, of course. Because the whole point of what we're talking about here is to make everything more consistent and have every arrow behave identically from shot to shot.
All right. And now every single arrow, when you shot it, first of all, they are different and every shot is going to be different. Now you're talking a nightmare. You end up with dealing the same arrow like the carbon, like the aerodynamic solution, the micro stingers, the tubular, large chain shaped, smaller arrow. Mm-hmm. Same thing. Because in some way I do the reverse, but remember we talk about it. We at this moment cannot build it effectively based on the price we want. You may end up with a dozen arrows at $80 to $90 a shaft. You can't afford that.
Yeah, no, that's crazy.
Yeah, but
All right,
that's
so
now,
Yep.
that said, the 166 is pretty much needed this. So how do you do it? If you got to say a dozen of 166, you can now using the glue to install the aero concept tubing into the shaft, and you push the shaft no less than 3 millimeter deeper than the shaft. Then you finish it, you put the aero outside on top. Why do we do that? Remember, the fuel point go into the shaft no less than 3 millimeter?
yes,
So now you need to compensate for it. Otherwise, you
Right,
have to
okay.
cut your fuel point off before you can the end of the fuel point screw before you can put it in because it bottoms out.
yep, no, that makes sense. Okay, yep,
Now, that is the first one. We change the behavior of the 166 so that instead of we using everything the same, the arrow recovers significantly because we are doing a harmonic cancellation and oxidation reduction process.
hmm
That's one
and that's
way.
because of that's because
Correct.
got it.
Because we are forcing the entire magnet to a flex. But then, in a common term, excluding the technical side, yes, we are also changing the spine of the shaft. We are increasing the spine because we are shortening the behavior of the flex. So we're also shortening the recovery because we are less to start. So the recovery is faster. We also
Right.
control the directional variance in the front of the arrow because the angle of the entire front is less. Remember, the flex less. Now it's flexing like this instead of this. So you also increase the penetration because your angle variance is less now.
I got you.
That's
Which
the
then
first-
alleviates the issue that we had with like you were saying with two blade broadheads planing on impact.
Because
and
remember,
such.
with the two-blade broadhead, with the thinner shaft, the angle of, remember the fulcrum. Instead of right here, you're here. Now this is much more than this. See that? See the
Mhm.
difference? So with the arrow concept, where I'm stiffening this part so that this part can't flex much, which now make this less.
Yep.
Which is
Perfect.
we fundamentally change the behavior of the shaft. That's the first approach. The second approach is that now we move from we do the structural change. So instead of a full out, we go outside. That's the second approach. The third approach is we change the standard. So
What do you mean
instead of
change the
using
standard?
something like an 832 outsert and so on, because we know whatever we have won't work. So let's wipe everything clean and start from scratch.
So
We
you're
know
saying
that
go away from the archery standard, make a thinner
correct.
like
In
a
other
thinner
words, no
throat on
more
the
832, no more neck, no more fuel point, nothing. Because there's nothing can put inside. So don't put any.
So then what would you use instead? Like a glue on type of deal or
No, that's the reason we at Firenuck way back in 2017, we come up with a whole new system called the stalker. So imagine instead of putting something, try to put some fuel point in or broadhead inside the shaft. We put nothing.
how does it work then? If nothing's going inside the shaft, where does it go? Where is it
Correct.
going?
So there's no, besides the basic ATA standard, nobody say the fuel point has to be with the neck and the thread. So what happens if I decide to put a fuel point with a hole in it from the back?
Okay.
So instead of threading it, the fuel point thread onto something.
So instead of the field point being the male end, it's the female end.
Correct. Fuel point, body, everything become female end. So now what can I do is that I can build a piece. Imagine a screw with a neck in the middle. So the lower part of it glue into the shaft and upper part of it sticks out. Ta-da!
All right. That's incredible.
You eliminate the entire problem.
I love that.
You know what? I actually licensed that to Levi Morgan and friends in stock in the Swagger. The new Swagger system, that's a
Yeah.
license for me.
Really?
Yes.
Oh,
If you
I
look at
didn't
it,
see
that's
I didn't know that.
Yep.
That's really cool. So are you saying that so if somebody didn't want to spend the money to build Aero concept for a 166, instead they could use the stalker system and achieve somewhat of the same results?
correct. Because see now, the fuel point are no longer screw into it, but screw onto the stalker neck.
And can someone use both? Could you use the inner tube with the stalker
That's the
system?
reason we got Aero's concept stalker. Now you got the best of every world.
Wow. So, and that's why we're saying you can build an efficient 166, but you're gonna have to pay for it if you want it to behave the way a 246 or a 300 would.
Yes, you're gonna build. There's a lot more. There's a lot more involvement. But then another problem is that since the fuel point are no longer standard, the broadhead no longer standard. Nothing is standard, become proprietary. That means if you want to use a broadhead, you better be sure the broadhead we at Fine Art make is indeed what you want to use, because nothing works.
Yeah. And what broadhead what options would you have for broadheads then? Would all three of your
I
broadheads
got
work
the
for that?
entire
Or?
dagger series. I got the entire swing blade series. You technically got 13 broadheads to choose from.
Yeah.
From a fixed blade all the way to a 2.25-inch cut swing blade system.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're interested, you can go to Find Out website and type the word stalker, and then you can see all of them. And of course, unlike others, all my stalker system is not the same threading as the Levi Morgan and Friends systems. They use SAE. Mine's are all metric. And then not to mention, they don't have O-rings. I have O-rings everywhere because
And we use those, and we use them to be concentric too, right? The O-rings help with centering everything.
This is what my problem is. If you are really using a system that is outside of the norm, and yep, see this? That's a stalker. This part is inside the shaft, and this side is in front of the shaft. And you screw all those onto this.
I gotcha. So, I have seen that. I just didn't really, when I saw it, I was like, well, I'm not glue. I thought it was a glue on at first when I saw that. So I was like, I'm not using it, so I'm not going to pay attention to it. For those of you who are listening on the podcast version, remember, we do post this on YouTube as well. And Dorge right now has his catalog up. He's holding it up to the camera, and he's showing what this stalker system looks like. And honestly, this is freaking ingenious.
Thank you. Now look at
this.
This is the arrow. We reverse taper in here, just like this diagram. And that's where the arrow concept type, the shoulder.
Right. Man, that's amazing.
Now, let me use this and shock the archery target well guys. Remember in the old target well, you got break-off points on the 166?
I guess.
That means you got a point, you got a long stem, you can break whatever you need to form the way you need.
Yes,
right?
Yes. Yep.
Where's your node?
It changes every time.
Anytime you break it, the node is behind the stem and then add half an inch. When you change the weight this time, what do? The node do not change.
It doesn't change at all because you're just changing the effective length of what it is in there.
No, you just change the weight.
Right.
The effective length had not changed, ever.
Love that. I love that. You know, and go ahead, I'm sorry.
That is the reason this is the first time ever I got a 166 with an interchangeable field point, and it's huntable with a stalker system, and it's capable of arrow concept with reverse tapering. You remember?
That's amazing.
Reverse tapering.
Yeah. No, that reverse taper. When I saw that for the first time, I was blown away. Just because. So when I built my arrows a few years ago, and I built heavy arrows, heavy FOC at the time. But I was going through the process of literally tuning everything. I was insert tuning. I was spinning every arrow, turning it a millimeter at a time. Then I would go to the nock and I would shoot my arrows and turn the nock ever so slightly. And then like all of these things that I was doing, it took so much time. And mind you, where I used to live in New Jersey, where I live now in Pennsylvania, I couldn't shoot at home. So every time I needed to go shoot, I had to go out to a range and drive 45 minutes to go and shoot. Think about how time consuming it is. So yeah, sure, some of these things that Dorge sells cost more than your typical components, but you're also gaining time. You're gaining peace of mind knowing that every arrow is going to fly the same without having to spend the time to ensure it. So yeah, you're getting what you pay for.
Now I will show you this page. Those are my mechanicals.
These are the swing blades?
Yeah, swing blades. Aluminum and stainless steel. So with all the blades. That means everything I got in swing blades are also available in stalker. Plus a dagger. See that? No stem coming out.
Yep. And the nice thing about the swing blade, we'll get into that when we get into all the broadhead stuff and whatnot.
But now you see, with this fundamental change of the standard to fit the 166, I licked every single problem. Can this system be used on 204? Answer is yes, but that's mine. Most people will not follow. I'm not Easton. I'm not Matthew. Most people will not look at this and say, oh, this is the best thing since sliced bread. But in my personal opinion, can I use system in 204? Absolutely. Now you solve all the problems.
Yeah, but the problem is
you put the stuff inside the shaft, the stuff is outside.
Yeah, and the problem is that no one ever talks about the downside of the 166. No one is out here talking about why it is not an efficient arrow. Everything out there is why you should buy it. here are the benefits of the 166. And the benefits of the 166, as we talked about in the 204, they don't exist.
Yes, that's the sad part.
The thinner diameters are not giving you less wind drag or wind, it's not, you're not getting better penetration. Your broadhead is 2.5 inches wide. Those of you that are using mechanicals, those of you who aren't using mechanicals, okay, we're at 1 1/8 inch. It's still bigger than your arrow.
As a matter of fact, the thinner the arrow, the more the memory of flex. So when the arrow go into the animal in close range, the arrow was inside doing this. You got a lot more friction than less because the thinner shaft have significantly higher memory effect.
Absolutely. Now we're not here to hurt anybody's feelings. If you like to shoot a 166, absolutely.
I mean, I got customers still argue with me the Earth is flat. So you can believe what you want to believe.
Listen, and I talked about this. I don't know if you're familiar with Dan Johnson. He's a gentleman whose network we're on. He runs the Sportsman's Empire podcast network. He has the Nine Finger Chronicles. I don't know if you've ever listened to the Nine Finger Chronicles, but we were talking. I was on his show a couple weeks ago, and one of the things we talked about is: are you familiar with the MSU Deer Lab?
No.
Out of MSU, they have a deer lab where they do a whole bunch of different scientific studies on deer movement and deer, how they react, all these different things. And they did a 3-year study on moon phase, because all the old timers will tell you, you don't hunt the day after a full moon. The deer are out eating. This moon phase causes this reaction, and this moon phase causes the deer to move this way. And they scientifically proved that there is no measurable difference of deer movement based on the moon phase alone. It doesn't exist. And even when the science tells you that it doesn't exist, people will fight it, and you can't stop people from believing what they believe.
I tend to agree and disagree of the whole process because, you remember, a lot of study they do. And then based on my understanding with a very good friend of mine, his name is Scott Ernicus. He owns S&P Game Farm, and he got acquainted with a few hundred deers. What do you find out? The biggest issue with moon phase is not just the moon, but the ambient light. When you have a new moon, there is not enough light to the point that the deer can't see with their eyes. Their movement is minimal. When you got full moon with a non-cloudy day, there's enough light the deer can comfortably walk further and more. And then if you got a say new moon or no moon on ambient condition next to city, there's ambient light. The deer able to, just like if it's totally freaking dark, would you walk in places that you are not familiar with? Answer is hell.
And so the cool thing is that a lot of the deer that they did the study on, they had collared deer for 3 years. Then they were free range. They weren't on a farm. It was all free range, and they collected every 15 minutes. These collars sent the data. So it was like really, it was incredible. And the one thing I said was, okay, that's really cool, but I'd love to see that study done across the country. Like, do the deer in the Northeast, do they behave the same way as the deer in the South?
This is what I talked to Eric, which is the DNR officer next to me. It is based on the ambient light condition. That means the deer next to the highway when there's tall lights, or deer in the deep wood there's no light. The behavior is different because the amount, just like if you have no headlight on your car, how much driving would you do at night?
Not a lot.
If you got a really good mood, you can see. Would you do a little bit more driving? Well, that pretty much is what I'm trying to get at. In other words,
it's the same thing. Like I love hunting in like residential areas.
Yes.
Like obviously not in people's backyards. If I have permission, whatever. But I like to hunt closer to houses.
Yes.
Especially when the wind is blowing from the houses to the woods.
Yes.
Because they're used to the smell of people at that point. I can get away with a mistake or two.
Yes, you can. I mean, that's this year when I was hunting in Hallstatt, 160th Street, 172nd Street. Literally, I can see within, say, 150 yards from me, Illinois Highway 1. I'm shooting deer.
Listen, they're there. I tell the story all the time. There's deer in New York City. You know what I mean?
Hey,
so there's
new in downtown on Cook County. Okay, Cook County do not shoot that many, but this year there's 2. That belongs to me and my friend.
There's deer everywhere. So to wrap this up, because I think we've touched on everything we wanted to on the 166. For those of you out there who love the 166, we're not saying that you can't shoot them. We just want you to understand how your arrow is behaving. And maybe you've seen some things happen when you're out hunting that you don't like. Like, that deer, that arrow should have pass through? Why didn't that arrow pass through? Or I'm not shooting as accurately, at 30 yards as I feel like I should. I shoot really well at 70. Why am I not shooting as well at 30? So basically what we've been talking about today could be the reasons for that. And if you do want to shoot a 166, there are ways to make them behave equally as good or better than a 246 or a 300 if you are willing to spend the money.
Or the time and effort.
And the time and effort also, exactly.
Right.
And it should also, we're going to talk about this in the future, but since we're on the topic, the thinner the arrow, the harder the build if you're going to build it the right way.
Absolutely.
Because the tolerances are much smaller. So to wrap this episode up, I forgot to do it in the last one. I would like to do another one of those bow setups, except this time I'm going to give you my bow setup. Because in my head, I have an idea of what arrow I want to build. And I'm curious if what you're going to give me is what I came up with.
Okay.
So I want to shoot Arrow Concept 2. I'm planning on shooting Arrow Concept 2.0 on my next arrow build.
Mm-hmm.
I shoot a Darton Sequel 33, 27.5-inch draw length, 80% let off. But when you measure it, it's probably closer to like 82%. It's not actually 80%. And I'm going to shoot a lighted knock. And I should say I'm going to shoot an 85 grain head, which is going to, stick up a lot of ears, I think, because that's pretty unheard of these days. But anyway, that's my setup.
I will have two configurations, depends on distance.
Okay.
The easiest one to build will be start with the Gold Tip 300.
But I should have said that. I'm sorry.
Gold Tip 22.
46.
Okay, I will start with, because of that build, if you want long range distance, speed, I would start with the Victory HV or the Carbon Express Blue Streak Select, because now you're going to build up both ends. That will drop your weight. You will drop your weight significantly because you're doing Aero Concept 2.0. You don't want to lose too much on the weight penalty. I mean, if I am able to get the Carbon Tech Cheetah, will be what I'm waiting for, but that's a lot of work because the Carbon Tech Cheetah is like a 243, so you need to send the Aero Concept tubing, which may not be bad. And build an arrow at 26-inch long total, carbon to carbon, go for it. And then with the aluminum insert, that's it, nothing more.
So what I was going to do, which is actually pretty close to what you were saying, after seeing Tony Warden's research and looking at the end of that and seeing the speed degradation and the, oh my goodness, why can't I think of the momentum?
The residual impact.
The momentum loss.
Yes.
The comparison between high FOC and low FOC. My goal is to build an arrow as close to 7% as possible. That's what I'm looking to do.
It's closer to pretty much a target on Aero Concept 2.0. Because remember, Aero Concept 2.0 in some way is actually behave like, imagine, in the old Arrow, it's a freaking long train. Now you make the train shorter. So when it hits, it's all in.
So this is what I had in mind, and it's very close to what you said, except I'm thinking of Arrow Weave 246 with the titanium dagger at 85 grains with Arrow Concept 2.0 front and back, Arrow Vein 3 or 2. I haven't decided yet.
Doesn't matter. I mean, it will end up pretty much the same because your speed is not there.
And the fire knock, on the back end.
Okay.
And all of that considered, I'm looking at 430 grains roughly.
Yep. But then I will tell you, you end up with my build with the Carbon Tech Rhino. 25 years from now, you still look at that, doesn't it?
But that's why I want to.
Of the 24 Carbon Tech Rhino.
And that's why I want to build them, man. I mean, we're talking about tack, right? We're talking about the benefits of these arrows. And honestly, I want to showcase them. I want to be out there shooting these arrows.
It will be good because the 246 Arrow Weave is a very durable arrow at 300 spine. You even 350 spine, you're more than adequate.
Yep.
See, if you want a little bit more speed, I would say I would go with the Gold Tip 22 and then go with the light version of the 30L. So you end up with a lighter arrow for longer range. Because your pin gap will be better.
Yep. Either that or I was thinking if I wanted to stick with 246, the only other option I could find, maybe you have a better arrow in mind.
I told you.
But I was looking at the cheetah. And I was also looking at the Black Eagle carnivores. Because they're like
will not be, I mean, the carnivore will not be that good. I will look at the Carbon Tech Cheetah or the Victory HV. Those are the better approach on the 246 if you want lighter weight. And not to mention the 246 tubing. is a little bit on the heavier side compared to a 30L.
Mhm.
I mean, some people say, well, should I make a 24L? I say eventually I would, but at this moment, I'm looking in the middle of the road. When I built a 204, I was mistaken because I was putting too much weight. That's the reason that the L is the best seller. And for most people, yes, if you're going to cover Cape Buffalo, go for 200.
Yep. And who makes the cheetah again? Just
Carbon
the
really
carbon
thin
side.
stuff. The carbon tech cheetah is one of the better arrows, really. And the modulation of that is significantly better. But just remember, the cheetah is a 243. So every single carbon tubing, you need to sand it first and dry fit it before you fit it, which is good for you because your adhesion will be better.
Okay. Well, I was going to sand it anyway when I put the glue in. So, all right,
Good,
guys.
good,
So moving forward, I would really like to get some listener bow setups in here. So if you guys are watching on YouTube, leave a comment down below. To be honest with you, sometimes it's hard to see the stuff on Apple as far as those the comments coming in. YouTube is very straightforward. It comes straight to my email. It's right there. I see them right away, and I literally respond to every comment on our YouTube videos. So if you leave your bow setup, like your specs, your draw length, what bow you're shooting, and what your let off is, we'll start to give you some recommendations on the arrows that we think are best for you. So with that being said, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for joining us this week. If you like what you heard, as always, leave a review down below. 5-star review goes a long way. And until next time, remember, success is just a commitment away. Have a great week, guys.